The yoga figures are a series of 16 clay sculptures. Middle-aged women, that's the focus of all 16 of the poses, which is the first time I've actually made a conscious decision that rather than just dealing with a human subject, I'm dealing with a female subject. They're in these poses that are not idealistic poses by any means, and they are not idealistic yoga participants either. They are everyday women. They're very strong looking. They're very simple looking, devoid of anything going on in the outside world. They're from the inside working out, and I just wanted to see what would that look like. And what it represents is a lot of what women are doing today, which is trying to find themselves, trying to find a moment for themselves. And they're using yoga as a way to do that. So I'm using that yoga as a way to create a female form. I've got my eyes closed most of the time when I'm doing yoga, and I can't really see what anybody else is doing either. I only know what it feels like to be in a certain pose. So I thought, well, I wonder if I sculpt what it feels like to be in a pose, what would it look like to be in the pose? And the result of this whole body of work is what it feels like to be in these 16 individual yoga poses. The series of 16 figures does tell a progressive story about movement, in the sense that I'm starting with mountain pose, which is a pose that's very rooted to the earth, and while it may look like somebody's standing, I think the way that you see the forms and the weight of the figure standing, it does look like it's rooted. So it's a very simple form, and it goes from there until a downward dog, which is an upside down pose where your hands are on the ground, your feet are on the ground, the rest of your body is up in the air, down to Shavasana, which is really a kind of what they call a corpse pose. So it's the figure lying on the back with the palms up, and it's this prone figure that does not look like they're sleeping. It's consciousness in a totally relaxed pose. And then I think the last figure I did was a locust pose, where the figure's on its stomach and everything else is raised up behind it. It almost looks like the woman is flying, although, again, grounded on the earth. I wasn't thinking about that when I was doing it, but as soon as you put a woman on all fours, or a figure on all fours, you do start to think about the unity between humans and animals and maybe the rest of the world. This is the first sculptural series I've done in about 10 years. I spent 10 years painting after working 30 years in sculpting. I think that was a really interesting diversion and dealing with a different kind of perspective, a different kind of illusionary depth, and I pushed the color right to the edge and then I pulled it back. And then after that I was looking at the female form, and I got thinking I want to work again in 3 dimensions, and so then that's real perspective. It's not illusionary perspective, it's a form that needs to be worked on from the top and the bottom and the sides, and every single angle has to be taken into consideration in order for the form to be convincing. So after being away from sculpting for 10 years, you're using different tools, you have to set your studio up in a different way. It's almost like sort of rethinking the practice all over again. So I started working very small, and I would work for a really long time on a plastilina, which is a kind of clay that never hardens. So I could work for as long as I wanted on it. And I did. I spent 6 months working on these forms. And I started working in like a self-drying clay. But, it dries very quickly. So I used my non-drying clay form as a model and did these figures. So, I'm working on this for about a year. And then I was ready. I was ready to get back into the real clay again. So it's funny how one eases themselves into a certain material that speaks to them and works for them, and it's responsive to what it is, whatever the theme is. And in this case, they were these female figures in yoga poses. They're each hands-on, one of a kind, created and then fired in a kiln, and then after that I've dealt with some kind of a patina or a color on them, and I changed them all too. So what's interesting, of these 16 figures, you've got all different kinds of hues, which give you another sort of relative global perspective. There are also middle-aged women of many colors, as well as being in yoga positions. They're about 30 centimeters high. It's a size that you could pick up, that you could ingest, and I just think that that's an interesting metaphor, perhaps, within the yoga forms. After I had made these 16 figures, I was able then to move them around the studio and have them interact with each other. And sometimes I put 3 or 4 together, and then I'd sort of fool around a little bit about how much space do they each need, or do they need to be looked at individually? Can they interact with each other because they're individual forms that are within themselves? I mean, that's the whole idea of being in a yoga position. You're really not interacting with anybody. So can these forms interact? So I was having a lot of fun just moving them around to see how that worked. Every time I would walk in my studio, I would start laughing. I don't know why I find them funny, but I think they're funny because they're so sincere. I think, like in all my work, there's always an element of humor. So there's something about it that is funny, it's engaging, but then there's a serious undercurrent talking about women's place in society, talking about middle-aged women's place in society, idealism versus reality, and then just as a sculptural form unto itself. So I guess I hope that people will enjoy the pieces from all those perspectives, as an object but not objectified.